If you recently inherited a property and you're trying to figure out what to do with it, stay with me for the next few minutes because what I'm going to walk you through is something most people in your position don't think to calculate until they're already deep into the process. And by the time they calculate it, it's already shaped every option available to them. We're talking about what the property is actually costing you right now, every month, while you figure things out, not in vague terms, in real numbers. But before we get to the numbers, I want to talk about why most inherited property sellers don't do this math early, because it's not carelessness, it's not avoidance, it's something more specific than that. When you inherit a property, the practical reality of it doesn't land first. What lands first is everything else. The loss, the family conversations, the legal questions you didn't know you'd have to answer, the responsibility of handling something that belonged to someone who is no longer here to tell you what they would have wanted. Most inherited property sellers are managing grief, unfamiliar processes, and family dynamics simultaneously. And the financial reality of the property sits underneath all of that. It's there. They know it's there. But it never quite reaches the top of the mental queue because something more emotionally urgent is always ahead of it. That pattern is completely understandable. It's also the reason most inherited property sellers end up making decisions with an incomplete picture of what the situation is actually costing them. So let's build that picture now. Before you're deep into a process where the costs have already accumulated and the original options have quietly narrowed. An inherited property that you don't occupy carries 4 categories of ongoing expense. Most sellers know about 1 or 2 of them. Very few account for all 4 before they start evaluating their options. The first is property taxes. Depending on the location and assessed value of the property, this can run anywhere from a few hundred to several $1,000s per year. What most sellers don't immediately register is that property taxes accrue every single month, regardless of whether anyone is living in the property, regardless of whether any decision has been made, regardless of where you are in the process of figuring things out. The bill arrives quarterly or annually, but the cost is running in the background every day. The second is homeowners insurance, and this one catches more people off guard than any of the others. Here's why. Most inherited property sellers assume the existing policy on the property transfers automatically and continues without interruption. In many cases, it doesn't work that way. When a property becomes vacant or when ownership transfers to an heir, the coverage requirements change. A vacant or non-owner occupied property typically carries a higher insurance rate than a primary residence, and sometimes the existing policy lapses in coverage adequacy without the new owner realizing it. The scenario that plays out more often than it should: a seller inherits a property, assumes the insurance situation is handled, spends several months figuring out what to do, and discovers later that the coverage they thought they had wasn't actually protecting the property in its current status. By then, something has happened or nearly happened, and the conversation about insurance becomes a much more complicated one than it would have been at the start. Check your coverage status early. Know what you're actually paying and what you're actually protected for. The third is utilities. Even a vacant property needs to maintain basic utility connections to protect the structure. Heat in the winter to prevent pipe damage, electricity for basic systems, water to prevent issues with seals and fixtures. These costs are smaller than the others, but they don't stop. And for sellers who don't live near the property, there's an additional layer. Someone has to manage these utilities remotely, which adds coordination to what was already a logistically complex situation. The fourth is maintenance, and this is the one with the longest tail. A property in perfect condition today doesn't stay that way without ongoing attention. Lawn care, exterior upkeep, minor repairs that surface over time. These aren't dramatic costs in isolation, but here's what matters about maintenance specifically: deferred maintenance compounds. A small issue that would have cost a few $100s to address in month 2 becomes a more significant issue in month 6. And the condition of the property at the time of sale directly affects what options are available and what those options return. A property that enters the process in excellent condition has more options and more leverage than the same property 6 months later with visible deferred maintenance. That gap is rarely recovered at the closing table. Now let's put this together in real terms. I want you to think about a seller. I'll call her Diane. She inherited her aunt's home about 4 months before she came across this video. The property was in great condition. She knew she needed to do something with it, but wasn't sure what, and life kept moving faster than the decision did. She figured she had time. The property wasn't going anywhere. She'd get to it. What she didn't add up: property taxes running about $350 a month, homeowner's insurance, which she'd had to update to a non-owner policy, running $180 a month, utilities at about $120 a month to keep the property protected through the winter, lawn maintenance every 2 weeks at $80 a visit. Total, roughly $730 a month. 4 months in, before she'd even started the process, she'd absorbed nearly $3,000 in carrying costs, and she was still at the beginning. By the time she listed, negotiated, cleared contingencies, and closed, she was closer to $7,000 in accumulated costs on a property she hadn't made a single dollar from yet. That $7,000 didn't come from the sale. It came out of her pocket while she waited. Diane's situation isn't unusual. It's actually closer to typical than most people realize. Here's what the math looks like for your situation. Take your 4 cost categories: property taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance, and add them together for your specific property. Whatever that monthly number is, hold on to it. Now, consider the timeline of the path you're most likely thinking about. A traditional sale, listing with an agent, going to market, finding a buyer, runs a minimum of 60 to 90 days from listing to close when everything goes well. Add the preparation time before listing, typically 4 to 6 weeks for an inherited property where the heir needs to coordinate access, assess condition, and find representation, and add the time between right now and when you actually begin that process, which for most sellers in the early stages is still weeks away at minimum. A realistic total timeline from where you are today to a closed traditional sale is 4 to 6 months, possibly longer if anything in the process doesn't go cleanly. Take your monthly carrying cost, multiply it by 5. That's a conservative estimate of what this property will cost you between now and the day a traditional sale closes. And that number doesn't include preparation expenses. It doesn't include agent commissions. It doesn't include closing costs. Those come out of proceeds at the end. What it tells you is the real cost of the timeline, not just the cost of the transaction. Now, here's the part most sellers don't think about until it's too late. Carrying costs don't just cost money. They quietly reshape your options. Every month, the costs accumulate. The gap between what the property is worth and what any path forward actually puts in your pocket gets a little smaller. Not dramatically, not visibly, just steadily. And that gap is what determines which options remain available to you and what those options are actually worth when you get there. Most sellers evaluate their options based on what the property is worth today. What they should be evaluating is what each option returns across its real timeline, including what the carrying costs consume along the way. That's a very different calculation, and it almost always changes which option makes the most sense. Here's what I want you to take from this video. The goal isn't urgency. You don't need to make a decision today, but you do need to make whatever decision you make with the full picture in front of you, including what each path actually costs across its real timeline, not just at the closing table. The next step in this series lays all four options available to you as an inherited property seller out side by side, what each one is designed to solve, what each one costs in time and certainty and control, and what type of situation each one actually fits. Not a recommendation, not a pitch, just a complete picture. Because the sellers who end up with the best outcomes aren't always the ones who moved fastest. They're the ones who understood the full landscape before they committed to a direction. When you're ready for that, the link is below.